Open the pod bay doors, Hal.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
What would you do with a brain if you had one?
Do? Why, if I had a brain, I could...
Miles per hour.
I could while away
46, 56 degrees.
So, it's really an honor to come up and give you a talk about real science before Steve Zissou shows you how it's really done. My training as an undergraduate is in mathematics and in engineering, and then I went and got a PhD in biology. And when you get a PhD, the very next thing you do is you go get a postdoc. And so my postdoc was in Berkeley, and my PhD was in rural Massachusetts. And so I moved from a hillside in rural Massachusetts where I could walk outside in an evening naked with a shotgun and discharge it in any direction without bothering anybody, to Berkeley, where my wife and I lived in 400 square feet. We had to make choices like, should we have hiking boots or sneakers at home? Because both kinds of shoes wouldn't fit. Not only were we stuck in 400 square feet, we were in 400 square feet inside someone else's house. And it turned out that this relationship had a profound effect on my career and on the way I think about the science I do. And that's because my landlady ran Pixar University. And so one day, Elise came downstairs and said to me, "Do you know anybody who can talk to us about fish?" And I said, "Actually, yes. I can talk about fish. How long do you want me to talk, and to whom?" And she said, "About an hour, and I can't really tell you. And what you will learn is that I can talk about fish for an arbitrary length of time to any audience whatsoever. It's just fun for me." So this first talk, which was in a stadium, a movie theater stadium, with 8 people and 500 seats. That first lecture turned into working on Finding Nemo for 3 years. And I spent a lot of time giving them fish stories, but I also spent a lot of time finding experts for them and generally making myself scientifically useful. And the movie came out. And right as the movie came out, I had to go to Brazil to a national and international congress of ichthyologists. Thousands of people who all study fish showing up together at one spot. And I was scared because my name is the last name in the credits. And I figured my colleagues were going to see me and ridicule me for actually having spent my time working on an animated movie. So I show up, and I kind of keep my hand over my name tag. But enough people know me that they're walking up to me and congratulating me. I couldn't believe it. My colleagues were so kind. That was a fabulous movie. My kids enjoyed it. I enjoyed it. You got so much of the science right. But there was one terrible thing, right? And every single one of them had a different terrible thing. And so I went from that meeting home and made a talk about the terrible things. And I'm going to give you one of them now, before I tell you about my real science, just because it's kind of fun to have one weird factoid for you. Everybody knows who this is? Yeah, that's Bruce. That's Bruce. And I got a phone call right after the movie came out, because my nephew went to the movie, and there he is. And he called me on his dad's cell phone. At the time, he was 6 years old. He's now a freshman at Harvard, and he and I got a paper published together. So he's come a long way, but at the time, he called me up and he said, "Adam, are those sharks boy sharks or girl sharks?" And I said, "Dexter, Shark's name is Bruce. It's a boy shark. He said, boy sharks have claspers. They got paired intromittent organs. The males use for fertilizing the females, and I did not see those paired intromittent organs on Bruce. ¿Qué pasa? And you may think, well, it's a Disney movie. At the time, Disney didn't own Pixar. They did distribute the movie, but they didn't own it. And Disney had nothing to do with the claspers getting cut off. What happened was, one day, I walked into the sculpture room, and you may not know this, but every animated character starts as a clay sculpture, and they're big. And I walked into the sculpture room, and there is the first sculpt of Bruce. And you know, I typically would walk around and get completely indignant about things that weren't right. And so I can't even speak. And the sculptor Jerome says, you can't speak to me. Go talk to Ricky. And I'm like, but. He said, go, Ricky, go to talk to Ricky. Ricky Nierva's the head of the character development. And I knocked on his door and walked into his office. He said, I've been expecting you. Ricky's the guy who would shoot me down. You know, I'd say, he'd say to me, where do we put the eyebrows on the fish? And I'd say, Ricky, fish don't have eyebrows, right? And he'd say, well, our fish have eyebrows. And I said, no, fish don't have, our fish have eyebrows. You can't act without eyebrows. Our fish have eyebrows. And I'd be objecting to this, he'd say, Adam, fish don't talk. It's going to be a bad movie if the fish don't talk. So you have to give us the eyebrows. He says, oh, I've been expecting you. And he cues up a chunk of film. Now, if you can remember this particular scene, there's two little tiny fish, Marlin and Dory, are in the foreground, right in the corner. They're talking to Bruce. And then Bruce turns around and leads them away. Bruce turns around in the width of the screen. Bruce is a darn near spherical shark. And Ricky queued up Bruce with claspers, and all you could see as Bruce spun around were these giant umbrellas. And I said, well, yeah, clearly you can't do that. That's very distracting. What about kind of, shortening them a little bit? And he said, we tried that. And you still, all you can see, you're just like, oh, that's sort of sad. So actually, Bruce was too short and fat to have claspers. It was not a family movie kind of issue. So now I'm just going to tell you a little bit about some of the science I do. I've tried, my science sort of is at the intersection of physics and engineering and biology. This is the best shallow water dive in the world. I'm underwater in about 30 feet of water with 17 ocean mantas all around me. And I'm there to try to understand an interesting thing. How is it that they feed on tiny, smaller than your fingernail, your pinky fingernail, tiny, tiny invertebrates and get to be so huge? A decent-sized one of these is from one wall to the other. They're big fish. And they're doing it by filtering teeny, tiny pieces of prey. And what's really remarkable is that you don't see it costing the animal anything. There's no effort in dragging this huge filter through the water. They just swim along as calmly and as gently as you can imagine. And I look at this filter. The filters are those dark bars there. And you can see the teeny pieces of prey in the black water. And I keep jamming my camera up in its mouth to try to see the passage of the prey items. And it occurs to me that there's something really interesting going on here. This is a kind of filtration that we can't imitate as engineers. You understand filtration. You've all done filtering. This kind of filtering, where you've got a grid and you've got some prey item bigger than the grid, is something you've done probably one night a week since you've been cooking. When you make pasta, you boil the water, a little bit of oil, a little bit of salt, dry pasta. You wait, and a rolling boil, eventually it gets nice and soft. You take a colander, you pour the water and pasta into the colander, and you give it a good shake. The pasta won't fit through the holes in the colander, so it's trapped. The water passes through. That's not what's going on in the manta rays. That dead-end sieving is not happening. Instead, the holes in the manta rays filter are much, much bigger, 10 times bigger than the size of the prey items they're eating. Since the prey are so teeny and the holes are so big, this is the pasta equivalent of boiling the pasta, setting the bowl in the sink, cranking open the window in front of the sink, taking the pasta and throwing the pasta and water out the window above the sink, having all the water go out the window and all the pasta into the sink. That doesn't seem possible, does it? No. Well, I had a grad student who investigated this and just found great morphological answers to how the manta rays do it. And that inspired me to poke at an undergraduate who's just a brilliant local community college student who started working out at Friday Harbor Labs and eventually got her degree from UW, and is now a PhD student at UC Irvine, where she's funded by the National Science Foundation. And Ashley made physical models from CT scans. She looked at my CT scans and tried to make actual sieves based on the manta ray. And my CT scans weren't good enough, and she eventually ended up drawing them herself. And so she designed these filter arrays. And I'm going to show you how it is that they work. Because what we did was we put these things in a flow tank. And up top is one of our 3D models that comes out of a 3D printer after you've drawn one of these things. And it has only a couple of levels of organization. The filter is very complicated, and we've completely abbreviated it into a bunch of little shoeboxes sitting side by side. And when you run water through there and you put some dye in so you can see how the water's flowing, I want you to see two things. First, when the water hits one of these shoeboxes, it spins really fast. There's a vortex generated. The other thing is, the water seems to be coming in and out of the screen. It's flowing back and forth across this model. That is called span-wise flow, and it's because there's back pressure that's keeping the water from diving through the model. That is not happening in the actual fish. And so we thought, well, let's add one more level of complexity. The little shoeboxes, each filter mesh pore, we're going to add these little teeth along the leading edge, which is what the manta rays have, and that's in the bottom. So now we've taken up some more of the space in that shoebox. We've crowded out some of the open space, which intuitively seems like it should make it harder to push water through, and instead it's much easier to push water through. The flow becomes much more organized. You get these very, very tight vortices, and there's no more hunting back and forth. This flow is very nearly drag-free. So it turns out that bottom picture is enough to actually make this filter work. And here's how it works. We call this filter a cyclonic net. And a typical filter, big particles can't go through the hole, and little particles can. That's, the pasta strainer, right? Well, here, we've put a little tripper in the flow. And what that tripper does is generate a vortex. And the size of that vortex is dependent on how fast you flow water across it. Very, very fast makes a high energy, narrow vortex. Slower makes a bigger vortex that's lower energy. That vortex blocks some of the hole. So now particles don't fall right through. So here is a, and you're not allowed to patent animals. This turns out not to be allowed. But you can patent ideas that you steal from animals. And so we stole this idea and we patented this concept. And the neat thing about it is it's a hierarchical filter. That is, it's got this design where you can sort of figure out levels of organization, and all the levels of organization are easy to manufacture. None of them are beyond our capabilities for manufacturing, even in a ham-handed place like my lab where we do most of our work with simple 3D printers. There's very, very low pressure drop, which is not typical of filters. The best thing is it can't clog. It can't clog because the holes in the filter are bigger than the items that are being filtered. And you can change what you're filtering by changing the speed of flow. So it's a pretty neat filter. And now one of my grad students, who's now a professor at Cal State Fullerton, one of her grad students has actually built these things, and they're now 90% efficient. So we just won a big prize in California for having generated these things and made physical models that work. So this is sort of the routine. I'm a natural historian. I like to spend time in the water. I like to spend time looking at animals in their natural environment. And I tend to find things that make me go, huh, I can't build something or buy something that does that job. And then I want to know how the animal does it. So I'll tell you another little story. This is about clingfish. This is a local fish. You can go right into the intertidal here, flip rocks and find them. I did it for years. I'd flip rocks, grab one of these cute little guys, and I would travel a lot with ichthyologists, and I'd say, look at this beautiful fish, and they'd stick their head close. And the belly of Gobier sox, the northern clingfish, is a giant sucker. And as they came in to look at the fish, I grabbed the back of their head, and I shoved the fish onto their forehead. And so I got this, and it would stick well enough that I could, hunt around and find my phone, and they'd be dancing around, and I'd take a picture of them. So I have a little collection of ichthyologists with this fish hanging down on their head. And then one day, I was just by myself flipping rocks and looking at these things, and I said, wait a second. This is a wet, rough, snot-covered rock. I can't buy a suction cup that'll stick to this thing. How the heck is the fish doing? And that turned into a long research project. Does the suction cup work? Yeah, it works pretty well. This is a dead clingfish. That's dead. That's the fish not adding anything by behavior. It will do that 250 times in a row without becoming less sticky. It may do it 251 times in a row. Unfortunately, with the quality of undergraduates that I can afford, I can't get them to test more than that many times. So in fact, we're pretty cheesed off at having to do 250. So when you look at that belly sucker, it doesn't look good, It's lumpy. This is just, I dyed it a little bit blue so you could see the lumps. That cup should not suck. You've all done this, right? You've got siblings. You get the suction cup and you apply it to a sibling, right? You take the smooth cup, you apply it to the smoothest part of the sibling, and it sticks. You don't go for the rough part. The cup doesn't have lumps all over it. That just shouldn't work. It turns out not only does it work incredibly well, and the data I'm going to show you are how we figured out how it works. So, on this x-axis here are models of rough surfaces, from super, super smooth, in fact a cast of glass, to, on the far right, very, very rough. As rough as the roughest sandpaper you use to remove finish from a wooden floor. So really rough sandpaper. And on the y-axis is just how well the fish sticks. And there it is, sticking at about 300 times its body weight to a glass smooth surface. When we look at lots of other surfaces, what you see is at every roughness, it sticks equally well. And it sticks a little bit better than it did to the smooth surface, which is mysterious. I published this. I was very proud of myself because I got a lot of people to do a lot of work and put my name at the end of it. It was excellent. And then my postdoc came along, and most of my postdocs and graduate students come to my lab because they're infuriated with me. They read something I've written and they're sure that there is a huge mistake, and they're often right. And Petra Ditska came to my lab and said, you know, I see this paper and it's horrendous. She's German. And one thing about Germans I will tell you is they're not a big fan of things that are 3/4 of the way done. That bothers them the way a stone in the shoe bothers most normal people. And she looked at this data set and said, yeah, if it gets rough enough, it's gotta let go. She's kind of right. But I said to her, Petra, you can't buy sandpaper rougher than the roughest stuff I tested unless they make the particles far apart to let the sawdust, the swarf, disappear. So that's why I didn't try anything rougher. She looked at me as though it was hard to believe that I had a job. And she said to me, well, why didn't you make your own sandpaper? That's a fabulous idea, Petra. Why don't you go and you make sandpapers even rougher than the roughest ones, and I will steal the idea. And I'll just get all the credit for it. So this is me. This is an experiment I did later. Eventually, you can have such a rough surface that the fish can't stick. But how rough? Really, really rough. 2 to 5% of the width of the disc before it lets go. This is sort of the equivalent of, with a handspan-sized disc, climbing the roughest granite you can imagine. You can climb any kind of concrete. You could climb Mount Rushmore in the rain. It's really rough surfaces. So you can't patent the fish, but if you can steal the idea, you can patent that. How do you do that? Well, back to the sibling, right? I mean, eventually, you pulled that suction cup off them. And the thing to understand is how it failed. When the suction cup fails, when a man-made, manufactured suction cup fails, you pull on it in the center, and the edges come in. The edges slide in, and the circumference of the suction cup gets smaller and smaller. So the material that was in the edge is being pushed into a smaller and smaller space. It's being compressed. And eventually, when you compress a material, it buckles. And that moment of Euler buckling allows fluid underneath, and the suction fails. So normal suction cups fail because they slide and buckle. How do you defend against that as an engineer? You build suction cups out of stiff material so that they don't deform very much. And you build the edges thick so the edges don't compress easily. But now, when you go to put it on a rough surface, the suction cup doesn't follow the rough surface because it's stiff and the edge is thick. So no man-made suction cup will stick to any of the surfaces that the fish would stick to. Instead, it immediately fails. Well, what about the clingfish? Remember that weird data point. The clingfish on glass stuck less well than when the clingfish was on any kind of rough surface. And that's because when the clingfish is on glass, it fails the same way a man-made suction cup fails. The edges slide in, you get a failure blood, and it lets go. But if you have any sort of roughness, then these little fingers, which are on those lumps, little tiny hairs, interdigitate with all the roughness on the surface, and they stick. Those edges are really high friction. And as you pull and pull and pull and pull, the edges don't move, and they don't move, and they don't move until they fail in a totally different way. They fail in peel. You take a piece of tape, you tape it down to a desk, and you pull at a low angle. That tape will eventually fail and peel, and that's how the clingfish suction cup is failing. When you're trying to build something that won't fail and peel, you can go very, very soft and compliant so it can follow the surface. You want little excrescences that interdigitate so that you get good high friction. So totally different design considerations. So a second case of a bio-inspired design from the sea. I've told you about two projects that are, I'd say, quite mature and are now, I would say, somewhat less interesting to me because I know where they're going and I see where the endpoints are. Now I'm going to tell you about something that's going on right this minute. In fact, I brought a bunch of my lab here with me, and two of them are working right now on this project. That is a CT scan of Sarah Salmus, a piranha. And when you look at that thing, I hope you see the teeth. The teeth are terrifying. Those are really neat teeth. And when I CT scanned it to look at the teeth. And I thought, wow, those are beautiful teeth. And then a moment later, I looked, and I saw something really strange. There's a couple of ribs coming down that seem to just end. And then there's a gap, and then the ribs continue, but they grew together. This is very mysterious. You know, if you've ever seen this anywhere else in the animal kingdom, I'd be surprised. It's not something you normally see. It turns out that it's because this piranha was bitten by another one. And when you think about what life must be like for a schooling fish in dark water that can't see well, but they hang out in very tight schools and they're very well armed, many of their discussions amongst themselves might result in damage. And that suddenly made this keel on the belly very, very interesting. And so Paulina Urban here is visiting from Poland and Germany, is working on a project to try to understand whether the larger the school, the heavier the keel. Whether they're better defended so that discussions don't end up with guts falling all over the Amazon, right? And so she and Matt Coleman, who's also up here, are working on that project. Now, this image, how many people here, young-looking audience, so I bet everyone knows, how many people here have heard of one of these newfangled things that the young people are all doing called Twitter? I'm looking out there. Is anybody raising a hand? I hope somebody heard of it? It was not working for me? Okay, one guy at the back has heard. This is a little bit disconcerting. I'm a professor. I'm used to asking questions and having students raise their hands. I have these little tests I do. I say, things like, raise your hand if you haven't peed in the pool. It's nice to see how many honest people there are. All right, we'll assume that many of you have heard of Twitter, and I tweet. I'm at a stage in my career where a 140-character tweet is as much use to me as a paper, so we consider it to be a final publication. And I was CT scanning these fishes, and I would put up the pretty picture on Twitter, and people would say, "Oh, that's a pretty picture." Very often I was CT scanning fishes with this guy, Thaddeus Busser, who's up here, and he specializes in fish like the very first one I showed you when I walked up here. They're really good looking. People say, "Oh, it's a great looking fish." And then they would ask about their favorite fish. When are you going to do bluefin tuna, salmon? And I would always tweet back, "Don't worry, I'm going to get them all. I'm scanning all fish." But I was lying. Because there's 33,000 species of fish. And at the time, I couldn't think of any way to scan all of them. But now, what I'm going to tell you about is how we are doing just that. We're scanning all the fishes. We've reached 1,830 species plus the, is it 100 that you have not put in the database at this point? plus 100 that my lazy colleague in front row has not put in the database in order to embarrass me in front of all of you. So there's 33,000, we're 1,830 into it. All of them are available to all of you. We release the data as we gather it, open access. So you can download it off of Open Science Framework or Morphosource. And it's even available as surface models, so you can rotate them in 3D and 3D print them, because a colleague in Germany decided that my slices weren't that useful to him, and so he generated a whole new website which made them 3D models. How do you do this? The key is the fish burrito. How many people here have had a CT scan? This is actually going to require you to raise your hand. 1, 2, 3. Okay, oh, fabulous. A bunch, oh, the appropriate number of people have. About 10. That's awesome. So, whether you've had a CT scan or just seen one in the movies, you know that there's a big donut involved and a bed. And either the bed goes through the donut or the donut goes down the bed. Either way, what you may not know is that the CT scanner scans everything inside the donut, not just the patient. They scan the person, but they scan the bed the person's lying on, the air above, the air below, and every single person here who's had a CT scan could have fit in that donut at the same time, which would have been a huge savings in healthcare costs. You're just lying there together, we CT scan you from one end to the other, and then digitally dissect. And that's what we're doing here. We take, in this case, I think it's 20 species, is that right? 18 species from one trivial subfamily of sculpin. I know that this is the very first fish burrito ever scanned because it's missing a key innovation that came with the second fish burrito that was ever scanned. Does anybody care to take a guess?
Tortilla.
Oh, a tortilla, no. The tortillas are radiolucent. It's actually wrapped in cheesecloth. So each of the specimens is wrapped in cheesecloth. They take a picture of it, wrap them all up, and make this burrito. But it turned out that little radio-opaque labels, so that you knew which one was which, very important. Very, very important. Because otherwise, the only person on the planet who could tell one fish from another is Thaddeus Booster, who's sitting right here in the front row. So what you then do is you take freely available open source software and you dissect this burrito. You pull out one fish, you pose it in an anatomically correct way, and then you do that over and over and over again. And what had been 5 years ago, 3 years ago, a PhD dissertation worth of data becomes the throat clearing for chapter 1. It's astonishing. You go from taking 3 hours per fish to 3 hours for 18 fish. And suddenly it's possible to scan all the fishes. And so that's what we're doing. Now, why would you do such a thing? I have no idea what other people are going to do with these data. Already, we've had people use the data in paleontology. We've had them use it in species descriptions, in trying to tell one species from another, in teaching what different kinds of fish look like. Lots of different uses for the data. I'm going to tell you about a project that I'm just starting. This one is in the absolute formative stages. I spend a lot of time in the intertidal. And lately, as I flip rocks and look out over Friday Harbor, I've been chatting with Bashford Dean about his research. Because he and I are both really interested in how and why fish are armored. If you don't know who Bashford Dean is, here he's shown dressed up in one of his samurai outfits. I'll give you a thumbnail sketch. He was born in the last year of the Civil War, and he was a graduate student of John Newbery, and He studied armored fishes for his PhD and became the curator of fishes at the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. In addition to deeply loving fish and the literature associated with fish, Bashford had a lifelong obsession with weapons and the defense against the damage of weapons. He collected spears and swords and pikes and armor. And he was the world's authority on it and became the only person to be a curator in a major natural history collection. And he was the founding curator of the Arms and Armor collection at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. So at the same time, he held these two curatorships. And he was convinced that armor had a really easily discerned function because his love was of pointy, slashy things. And his focus was on armor as a defense. And all of you have gotten into arguments. You've had verbal tiffs, set tos, trotted out your best points and had them stepped on. My advice for you is to debate with people who are dead, because you will win all of the arguments. And in sort of assessing what Bashford had to say about armor, I decided really that he had missed a few very important functions for armor, because armor isn't just for defense. There are many examples of armor that is designed purely to inspire awe and lust, and other armor that's designed to inspire fear and promote a sense of understanding. And finally, armor sometimes is a good offensive weapon. What am I talking about here? This is a picture, again, it's Bashford, it's Central Park. He's in one of his outfits with one of his guns. This is the First World War. He wrote an entire book on World War I armor. And you know that I come from a very small town. I live just outside of Friday Harbor. And my wife is fond of saying that I fought hard to be in the top 10 for eccentric human beings on the island. And any time she feels that I'm sort of straying into the top 3 or 4, I point out to her that Bashford convinced his wife to wander into Central Park with him and shoot those holes in his armor while he was wearing them. And she admits that I'm not even close to Bashford. It makes me like seriously second team. But armor, if it's designed for defense, does tell you something about what the animal is defending itself against. And that, for me, is the interesting part. I'm interested in looking for biomimetic models in armor. So the armor I want is armor like that, where you can look at it and read what it's doing. I am much less interested in armor like Ferdinand's, the Holy Roman Emperor, Ferdinand II. This armor, now if I were to take a sword and take a swipe at Ferdinand's noggin, and Ferdinand, being an agile young king, were to duck, I still might clip that giant chicken on his head and break his neck. That is not armor that's designed for defense. It is, however, solid gold. That's real gold, chased with silver. It is inspiring lust, I can see it. I see a sweaty brow right there. That's awe and lust. This is armor designed to inspire awe and lust. Another suit of armor, this one from Japan, with a truly terrifying visage. This armor, with its clear wear marks, is designed to scare the pants off you as you look at this person. It's designed to tell you, I have stood right here before, and I'm still standing here. I've played this game. Are you sure you want to pull that sword out? Right? It's to promote fear and understanding. And finally, and almost trivially, you know that armor is quite good as an offensive weapon. So, from my point of view, I'm interested in trying to find biomimetic models. And so I've CT scanned all of a local armored fish. This group of fishes lives right around here. You can't flip rocks and find them, but if you drag a seine, if you drag a trawl, you will find them. They're very common, they're fully armored all over their body. And, I mean, this one is so hardcore, I've colored in green armored scales that are on its eyeball. Not above its eyeball or around its eyeball, that run right across the middle of its eyeball. This is a well-armored fish. And it turns out that once I thought through what armor was for, I was able to figure out which groups were falling into which category, and hence which ones I'd like to look at for bio-inspired design. So 3 of the subfamilies have this beautiful unadorned armor, very overlapping, thorough. It's clearly armor against something that picks at you. I think shrimp probably, but I'm not sure. And this is defensive armor. It serves little other purpose as far as I can tell. In contrast, in the dragon poachers, you have this armor that's full of excrescences and joy. You know, the largest member of this group, Persis japonicus, has these giant awnings over each eye. And they're designed so that any incoming blow is funneled down that awning and right into the eyeball. Clearly not adaptive as armor, but it looks incredibly spiffy. And I think it's for posing. I think this is awe and lust. And then there's this whole group that's quite diverse right in this local area. This group that has big spikes. They've got visible wear. When we look at the CT scans and the SEMs and the little spikes, you can find pieces where they're broken off. These are animals that are showing each other their armor and then wrestling around with it. They're really, this is useful armor offensively and defensively and for showing that they are well armored to other, in fact, we think male fish. So where should I look for biomimetic models? Obviously not in that family that was very showy. And it sort of depends. It looks like there's 2 directions you can go. Pure defense or defense and offense. From my point of view, I'm interested in pure defense. I want to know how you can shed projectiles, particles, sharp bits in disaster areas. So for me, I want to look in that group, the smooth alligator fish and the pygmy poachers and things like that. So I think that's pretty much all I wanted to show you. I'll show you a few pictures of people who spent time in my lab. Do I have a Thaddeus picture in there? No. Yeah, there he is. There he is. There's Thaddeus. And up there is the guy that runs the lab. And Paulina has not yet been willing to get herself photographed, but she'll do that shortly. She'll be replacing somebody in there. So that's a couple of years worth of folks who actually do the work in my lab. And then we get funded by the National Science Foundation. And anytime I go anywhere to give a talk, I point out that I don't get to go and give these things without the support of my family, who sacrifice a lot and work really hard to make it possible for me to come and chat. So my daughter Ellie, who's already at 10, able to hold course in altitude. And we flew over here just now, the 4 of us from Friday Harbor. My son Abel, who's big on catching the local introduced species. And my wife Sherilyn, who's a Pilates instructor, even when eating an ice cream cone. So, with that, I'll be happy to take any questions, and then we can start out on the Life Aquatic. Yes?
You said you CT scanned a manta ray.
Yes.
How did you do that if they're so gigantic?
I CT scanned a small one in a very large CT scan system. Yeah. And also, I CT scanned a whole one, but we've also CT scanned parts of the filter separately. Yeah. Yes?
Would there ever be a possibility to put a CT scan in the water?
No.
Okay.
No, it's not something you want to do. So one of the things that's really important about CT scanning is the thing you're scanning should move as little as possible. And the reason is that the way it works is this. You can see that's a hand. CT scanning, instead of using light to make the shadow, uses X-rays. But it works with those X-ray pictures to turn a series of still images into a reconstructed 3D object. So you could have mapped my hand and in whatever configuration my fingers were, simply by looking at still images of those shadows. If, while you're spinning the animal or spinning the CT scanner, it moves, none of the math works. So you don't actually want to deploy one of these things in the water. You want your things to be nice and still. And the way I ensure that is I work with museum specimens. So I work with specimens that you can then go back and say, this was the exact animal that Adam CT scanned. They come from the museum, they're fixed in formalin and stored in ethanol. They're quite dead. It also cuts down on objections.
How do you go back and repose the fish afterward?
So how do you go back and pose the fish? You actually dissect it out of the can, so now it's just the fish. And then you simply rotate it and spin it and put it in an anatomically useful view. Yeah, it's actually quite easy. One more back there. Yeah, are there efforts to CT scan other animals? Yes, in fact, the National Science Foundation just gave us $2.5 million to scan all the vertebrates. So within the next 4 years, you'll have 40,000 species of vertebrates.
Was that first example you show of the fish in armor, was that a sturgeon?
No. There's no sturgeons here. You mean here?
It was not, maybe it was the second one. It was like a whole. No. That's it. No. Wait, go back. That.
That's not a sturgeon.
What's that?
Xenoretmus triacanthus. It's a poacher. They're all poachers. Every one of them.
Okay.
It's poachers all the way down. In
Okay.
fact,
I didn't know.
in this talk, if it wasn't a poacher, it was almost certainly a sculpin.
Okay.
And poachers are a kind of sculpin. So really, the whole talk was about sculpins.
Okay.
Except for the piranha. Yes.
It strikes me that your research is very interdisciplinary, and I was wondering if you could speak to the value of the arts, humanities, and social sciences in relation to biology and other natural sciences.
Yeah, so it is interdisciplinary, both by my own personal nature. I spent a lot of time doing different things because I was never sure what I wanted to do for a living. And so I brought a heavy math and engineering background to this. But my mom's an artist and my dad's a writer. And so I've spent an awful lot of time making art out of these things. And what I can tell you is that in looking at these as art objects, I learned things. Thaddeus first came to the lab and scanned 30 or so species, and I grabbed this one. To me, it was a very striking fish. And I started playing with it and working with color maps and posing it in different ways. And as I was fascinated by it, I realized that some of the artistic reasons I was fascinated by it had scientific input. I love the asymmetry. The left preopercular spine is broken and has grown back bifid. The right preopercular spine is a beautifully unadorned spike. And the moment Thaddeus and I started talking about these, we realized that the dominant hypothesis for what they did was almost certainly wrong. These are not defensive weapons. They're crappy defensive weapons. If you're trying to stab someone, you take a knife. You take a knife and you stab it all the way into them until it hits the blade guard. And if you want to be thorough, you yank it out and do it again about 40 times. look at that right side stabbing device. It's got a whole bunch of pokey out things midway up the blade pointing the wrong dang way. They're gonna make it harder to stab. That's not a stabby thing. And then you say, well, why is it busted? Why is the other side busted? I love that it's busted. Artistically, I love it. It's busted because these guys wrestle with them. They joust like deer. They get those antlers locked up and they roll around on the bottom, and sometimes one snaps and grows back funky. That's why they're not trying to kill each other with it. That's why it's not a beautiful stabbing device. It's a way of having male-male combat work without killing the other guy. So for me, the art of this and the science of it are deeply intertwined. One thing I love about my job is I spend an awful lot of time making things that please me. Not everyone's job, they can sort of sit around for hours on end saying, I like that one. That's prettier now. So, yeah.
For the manta filtration system, does that scale down even like to the molecular level?
Almost certainly not. It turns out, and there's no way to do this without getting technical. It turns out that the way this thing works has to do with a fundamental property of fluids in motion. Fluids have two regimes. Either they're turbulent, and the things that are dominating are the inertia of the fluid, or they're laminar, they flow very smoothly, and the things that dominate are the stickiness of the fluid. And the transition between those regimes is what makes this filter work. And that process doesn't scale easily. So as you get smaller, it becomes harder and harder to induce that inertial flow. So basically, we suspect there's a lower size limit in the millimeter range where it just doesn't work. Yeah.
So I really admire kind of how intersectional your science work is, and I'm just kind of wondering what I guess your advice or ideas would be for trying to bring that intersectionality to our own work in science or in other fields, kind of fostering that kind of thing. 'Cause in general, I think intersection is a really good thing to have in all fields.
Well, so the question had to do with intersectionality and how you might foster it. I'm not sure I agree that you have to have it in all fields. Some of my favorite colleagues are monomaniacal and incredibly focused. I'm not, in part because I'm very much on the ADD thing. For me, it's difficult to get past, it's a squirrel. And so a lot of what comes out as intersectionality is that I enjoy working with lots of different smart people, and I don't make judgments about what's going to be fundamentally interesting based on the science. I do it based on the people, and so I've surrounded myself with people who think in very different directions. And I suppose that if I were to give advice to a scientist who was interested in doing more of this, it would be to be a lot more open to the kinds of science that you think are boring, and instead find people who do things you think are boring but who are interesting themselves, that you like hanging out with. Because if you can get them to transmit their passion about what they're doing, you'll find it infects your work. You'll find that suddenly you're finding important things about what they do and how it relates to what you do. And I'm fundamentally uninterested in climbing around in the slimy outflows of sewage systems to catch new species of stingrays. But Matt has, if you follow his Twitter, it's basically 1/3 of his Twitter is him dressed up in things that are so stinky you don't want to be in the same county. I'm just setting you guys up to be chatted with later. None of them are single. This isn't that kind of setup. but they're all seriously obsessed. Yes.
This is not really pertinent, but you say fish and fishes interchangeably.
Well, so it turns out there's a grammatical Nazi definition of fish and fishes. If you're talking about a lot of one species, it's fish. If you're talking about a lot of individuals of different species, it should be fishes. And this to me is like the plurality of the concept of data. It is of little interest to me. Never get invited back. If there's anything else, I think maybe we could save it after Steve Zissou does this awesome job. So thank you very much.
Thank you.